It wasn't the silence that was remarkable, it was the sheer weight of it. It pressed down on the furniture, settled on the windowsills like the finest layer of ash, and clung to the velvet curtains, suffocating the morning light before it could reach me. This wasn't the meditative quiet I used to crave on Sunday mornings after a grueling week at the restaurant. This was the quiet that screamed of a void. It was the absolute, crushing silence of a life that had stopped breathing. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are. Listening in the comments, my days now begin, not with an alarm, but with a visceral awareness of her absence. I am a man built of habit, and grief is the master architect of my new routine. I wake before the sun dares to claim the sky. Not rested, but simply out of options. Sleep lost its restorative magic 18 months ago, becoming a fragile, temporary reprieve from reality. The house, an old Victorian built on stubborn foundations, groans around me as the cold seeps in, a reminder that some things, unlike people, continue to stand even when broken. I shuffle into the kitchen. The linoleum tiles are worn smooth beneath the path I've traced thousands of times. My slippers, a Christmas gift from Margaret years ago, whisper a soft, weary confession against the floor with every step. I don't turn on the main lights. I prefer the gloom. It mirrors the landscape of my mind. The ritual demands coffee. I measure the grounds with a clinical precision that would have amused Margaret. She always accused me of being a perfectionist, even with something as simple as a morning brew. Now, I understand that the rigidity of the ritual is my only defense against chaos. It's something to do with my hands, something mechanical to keep the mind from circling back to when she was here. I rarely taste it anymore. It's just a delivery system for heat and caffeine, designed to jumpstart a heart that feels perpetually sluggish. I take my mug to the small breakfast nook. Across from me sits the chair. The empty chair. It's not just an object. It's an installation art piece, perfectly preserved in its stillness. A monument to a life irrevocably altered. It was Margaret's spot. For 32 years, that space had been filled with her. Her energy, her warmth. She had this habit, I can still hear it, of humming softly while stirring her coffee. A tune that never had a name. A melodic drift that made the mornings feel less ordinary. I used to tease her for it, calling it her breakfast song. Sometimes mock singing along until she rolled her eyes and gave me that gentle, forgiving smile. One day, "Joseph," she'd said, her voice low, and knowing, "You'll miss my silly humming." I didn't believe her then. I was too preoccupied with the present, too foolishly secure in the belief that our present would last forever. But I do now. I miss the silly humming, the specific rhythmic clink of her silver spoon against the porcelain, the way she would blow across the rim of her cup before taking the first sip. I miss her presence more than I could ever put into words. The world tells you to move on, a phrase I despise. They speak of grief as if it were a train, something you board, suffer through the journey, and then alight, leaving the sorrow behind on the tracks. What they don't understand is that Margaret wasn't a destination or a stopover. She was my compass when I lost her. I didn't just lose a spouse. I lost my sense of direction, my magnetic north. The world outside keeps turning, oblivious to the fact that I am standing still, hoping that perhaps the earth might notice one missing piece and stop. Just for a moment. After Margaret passed, I thought I could fill this profound emptiness with external noise. I threw myself into the restaurant. The clatter of pans, the shouted orders, the frantic, purposeful energy of the kitchen became a temporary anesthesia. For a few hours each day, I could pretend that I was still part of something vital, something living. But even that defense mechanism has failed. Home has become a museum of absence. Every object here is a fragile, unbroken thread, connecting me to a life that no longer exists. Her perfume bottle sits, untouched, on the dresser, its scent only faintly traceable now, requiring me to press my nose right against the glass. Her books line the shelves in the perfect, ordered way only she could manage. Her handwriting still marks the margins of the cookbooks she swore she'd master someday. I cannot bring myself to move or discard any of it, to clean, to tidy, to replace. It feels like an act of erasure. So, the dust collects. Illit. Maybe the dust is just my way of keeping her close, of preserving the exact moment she walked out of the frame. Sometimes, late at night, I catch myself talking to her, not in a dramatic outburst, but in small, tired murmurs. A comment about the weather, a question about what she would cook for dinner tonight, a quiet apology for not visiting the cemetery last week. I know it sounds crazy. Yet in those moments, that powerful, gentle sense of her presence returns patient, understanding, and always, always forgiving. This is the life I live, suspended between a perfect past and an unbearable present. I am Joseph, the widower, the ghost in his own beautiful house, condemned to a perpetual conversation with silence. The man who once knew happiness intimately now only knows its echo. I keep telling myself that one day this silence will ease. But until then, I sit, listen, and wait for a voice that has been eternally hushed. This profound silence, the one Margaret's absence carved into the very structure of the house, wasn't merely a result of losing my wife. It was a failure I owned entirely, the final, desolate outcome of pushing away the only other person left who shared her memory. If the grief for Margaret felt like an amputation, the state of things with Ryan felt like a self-inflicted wound that had never been allowed to heal. Ryan, our son, our only son, a man I loved fiercely, yet one whom I hadn't truly connected with in years. The distance between us wasn't measured in miles. He lived only an hour's drive away, but in years of hardened pride and unspoken words, it was a silence deeper, perhaps, than even the one Margaret left behind. Because this one was chosen, the argument that finally became the final stroke in our portrait of estrangement began, as most familial catastrophes, though, over something trivial. It was money, of course, but it was really about much more ambition, expectation, and the fundamental choices we make in life. Ryan had just finished university, bursting with the kind of ruthless, modern-day hunger for success that Margaret had found endearing but that I found profoundly irritating. He was focused on scaling up, on investment opportunities, on a business model that seemed to value numbers over people. I, a man who had built our successful restaurant on the slow, honest, back-breaking work of his own two hands, saw only recklessness. The tipping point, however, was his marriage to Emma. I had tried, truly, to welcome Emma into the family, but there was a glossiness to her, a constant calculation in her eyes, that set my teeth on edge. She came from a world of inherited wealth and sharp edges, and she viewed our cozy, bustling neighborhood restaurant not as a labor of love, but as a dusty, under-monetized asset. Our final, vicious argument, the one that still rings in the deep corners of my memory, happened the night Ryan announced their sudden, low-key wedding plans. It escalated quickly. He accused me of being a dinosaur, a man stuck in the past, incapable of understanding true opportunity. I, in turn, told him he was throwing away his integrity for a woman who valued a balance sheet more than a relationship, sacrificing his potential for her expensive tastes. "You want me to remember where I came from?" he had shouted, his face contorted with the kind of anger only a son can direct at his father. "I remember the late nights, and the stress. I remember you chasing a dream that will die with you. Emma and I are building something that will last." My last words to him were cold, sharp, and final. "Then go build it. Ryan. Just don't come crawling back when the foundations crumble." I didn't believe them when I said them, but the words did their job. They built a wall out of sheer, towering arrogance, my arrogance. The subsequent years have been measured in tokens of obligation rather than true connection. Birthdays came and went. A sterile, minimalist card from Emma. A curt text message from Ryan. Enough to remind me that he was alive. That he existed somewhere in that glittering, corporate landscape. But never enough to make me feel like I still had a son. It's strange. The particular torture of loving someone so deeply, yet not knowing how to reach them. I used to place the entire burden of the distance on him. He was the one who left. He was the one who changed. He was the one who chose money over family. But time, the ultimate confessor, has since made me realize the fault was not his alone. I was Margaret's rock. But I was also built of the same stubborn material as my own father, inflexible, quick to judge, and terrified of change. After Margaret passed, I retreated further. I built walls out of my grief, cemented them with my pride, and then stood in the dark, wondering why no one could find their way in. The truth is, I missed him terribly. I missed the sound of his laughter echoing in the now silent hall. I missed the clumsy pride on his face when he showed me his first report card. The way he would always order a milkshake at the restaurant, even when he was clearly too old for it. Those small sounds, like Margaret's humming, were the heartbeat of a life I could no longer retrieve. I sit here every morning, a man staring at an empty chair, fully aware that I have allowed another chair, my son's chair, to become just as empty in my life. And I have spent 18 months wrestling with the bitter knowledge that, while Margaret's death was fate, Ryan's absence was a choice driven by my own inability to swallow my pride and find a way back to him. I tell myself, solitude is a choice, that it's easier this way. But it's a lie I repeat to survive. The quiet of the house now feels like the deep, vast chasm I allowed to form between me and my son. I was a father without a compass. And now I am simply a man, waiting for something, anything, to break this unbearable stillness. And then, the phone rang, a harring, unexpected sound in this mausoleum of a home, promising either the ultimate redemption or the final destruction of all I have left. I had just finished my second cup, the bitterness settling in my stomach like the bitter residue of years gone by. I was lost, as usual, in the silent dissection of our failed relationship, examining every sharp word I had uttered to Ryan, every missed opportunity to reach out. I was a man perfectly settled into his penitence, wrapped tightly in the cloak of his own making. Then, the ring. It wasn't the familiar, soft notification chime I had set for incoming text messages. It was the full, insistent, almost violent blare of the landline. A sound so utterly out of place in this mausoleum of a home that it made me physically jump. The noise sliced through the oppressive silence, unalarming. Aggressive breach of my carefully constructed solitude. My hand froze midair, hovering over the coffee mug. Who uses a landline anymore? More importantly, who knows this number? It was reserved for the bank, the utilities, and, well, Margaret, since she left. The thing had been nothing more than an antique piece of technology, collecting dust on the kitchen counter. I watched the phone, pulsating with an urgent, alien light. My first cynical thought was that it was a telemarketer, trying to sell me something I neither needed nor wanted. But as it rang a third time, a demanding, inescapable summons, a terrible, thrilling suspicion tightened in my chest. I lifted the receiver. My voice was a croak, unused and rusty. "Hello, Dad, it's Ryan." The two words hit me with the force of a physical blow. The sound of his voice familiar, yet profoundly distant. Stripped of the anger of our last real conversation, was almost unbearable. It felt like hearing a beloved song played after decades of silence. I couldn't speak. I simply stood there, gripping the receiver, trying to reconcile this sudden, shocking intrusion with the quiet, empty routine I had mastered. "Dad, are you there?" he asked again. A slight edge of impatience. The old Ryan creeping in. "I'm here." I managed. My voice flat. "What is it?" He cleared his throat. A small, nervous sound I remembered from his childhood, before big exams or difficult requests. "Look, Dad. I know it's been a long time. Too long. And I know things ended badly. But Emma and we've been talking. And we really want to fix things." Fix things. The phrase was too clinical, too neatly packaged for the canyon that existed between us. But the sentiment, the sudden, unexpected vulnerability behind the corporate veneer made my carefully built emotional walls tremble. "We want to invite you for dinner this Saturday," he continued, the words coming faster now, as if rehearsed. "Just a small family gathering. Emma's making that rack of lamb you always liked. Please, Dad, it's time we put the past behind us. We miss you. We miss you." The words were potent, intoxicating. They cut straight through the dense fog of my resentment and landed directly on the exposed nerve of my longing. Missed opportunities. Missed years. Missed connection suddenly. The possibility of retrieving some of that lost time loomed larger than my pride. The subsequent silence on my end lasted maybe 10 seconds. But in that suspended moment, I wrestled with every demon I possessed. The cynical voice of the grieving widower whispered, "It's a trick. It's always a catch. Don't trust the sudden shift." The voice of the proud, stubborn father shouted, "He left you. He chose his ambition. Don't let him win." But then, the quiet voice, the one that still carried Margaret's gentle wisdom, spoke up. Hope. Hope. It was a terrifying concept. It meant exposing myself to pain again, risking further rejection, admitting that I wanted this more than I wanted to be, right? It meant dismantling the protective shell I had spent 18 months perfecting. Yet, the thought of seeing Ryan, of sharing a meal, of sitting at a table that felt genuinely full again, was a lure too powerful to resist. I don't know. "Ryan," I hedged, needing a moment more of control. "Please." "Dad," he pressed, a note of genuine urgency now. "It's important. Emma really wants to make amends. 2, it's just dinner. No pressure. We just want our family back." That was the key. Family. The word struck Joseph like a chime, resonating with the hollow echo of the empty chair in the breakfast nook. Margaret would have insisted. she would have already packed my bag and driven me there herself. For Margaret, for the chance to redeem a fraction of what I had so carelessly thrown away with my son. I knew I had to go. Saturday, I confirmed. The word feeling both exhilarating and terrifying as it left my lips. I'll be there. I hung up, placing the receiver back into its cradle with careful, deliberate slowness. The house was silent once more. But this time, the silence felt different. It was pregnant, charged with expectation. The invitation was a lifeline thrown into the deep, dark chasm of our estrangement. I had grabbed it. Now, all that remained was to find out if it would pull me to safety, or simply snap under the weight of years of unresolved bitterness. After the line went dead, the silence that followed wasn't the heavy, suffocating kind. I'd grown used to. This silence was charged a nervous, electric hum of anticipation. I stood there, receiver still warm in my hand, staring at the dust-covered landline as if it were an artifact that had just delivered a message from a different lifetime. The invitation was a promise, a dangerous and exhilarating deviation from the script of my solitary existence. Oh, hope, I realized, felt exactly like fear. The remaining days until Saturday became an agonizing stretch of internal debate. My cynical side, the one hardened by grief and betrayal, screamed warnings. Why now? Why the sudden, perfectly orchestrated olive branch? This wasn't how Ryan operated. This wasn't a man who valued sentiment over strategy. The old, cautious Joseph whispered that this was a trap, a poorly disguised maneuver to get access to something I still possessed. But the other voice, the quiet, persistent echo of Margaret's optimism, argued back. What if he's genuinely changed? What if losing his mother, and then almost losing his father through sheer stubbornness, finally made him see sense? It was the desperate, illogical hope of a parent yearning for reconciliation. I realized, with a wave of sickening clarity, that I would risk any pain just for the chance to sit across from my son and talk without the armor of pride. The ritual of preparation began. This wasn't just a dinner. It was an audition for a new relationship. I went to the closet and pulled out a suit I hadn't worn since Margaret's funeral, a dark, perfectly tailored fabric that smelled faintly of cedar and mothballs. I spent an entire afternoon ironing the shirt myself, performing the task with the rigid, focus-demanding precision I usually reserve for ordering inventory at the restaurant. Every crisp crease, every smooth layer of cotton was an effort to project stability, a desperate attempt to appear worthy of their newly extended affection. The greatest hurdle, however, was the gift. I couldn't arrive empty-handed, but a bottle of wine or a bouquet of flowers felt cheap and inadequate for the magnitude of the moment. After hours of deliberation, I settled on a piece of jewelry. Margaret had often worn a simple, antique silver locket. It wasn't extravagantly valuable, but it was imbued with deep familial history. I would give it to Emma, not as a peace offering to my estranged daughter-in-law, but as a symbolic gesture to their future, a blessing from the past. As I cleaned the delicate silver, polishing away the tarnish that had accumulated since Margaret last touched it, I saw our life reflected in its surface. Ryan's childhood, the restaurant's humble beginnings, the warmth of Margaret's hand in mine. This locket carried the only true currency I had left, a genuine connection to the family he had deliberately distanced himself from. The day arrived, slow and agonizing. I paced the old house, the oppressive silence temporarily replaced by the nervous sound of my own footsteps. I avoided the empty chair, unable to bear the thought of seeking Margaret's silent counsel. Her wisdom would have been a firm command. Go, Joseph, don't let pride win twice. Finally, I got into the car. The drive to Ryan's upscale, modern apartment building felt like crossing a temporal boundary. Every mile widened the gulf between my quiet, memory-laden world and the sleek, anonymous cityscape he inhabited. The closer I got, the more my fragile hope was tested by rising apprehension. I rehearsed conversations in my head. I will apologize first. No, that concedes too much. I will be reserved, but warm. No, that's too cold. I decided, ultimately, to trust the moment, to simply be his father, stripped of the burdens of the successful businessman and the wounded widower, pulling into the parking garage. I adjusted the tie. I barely recognized and touched the inner pocket where the locket rested. The hope, so carefully nurtured over the past few days, felt like a small, terrified bird fluttering in my chest. It was intoxicating. It made the air feel sharper, the colors brighter, the world alive again, in a way it hadn't been since Margaret left. But beneath the excitement, a small, dark ember of dread remained. Reconciliation is a beautiful word, but it carries a heavy risk, the risk of discovering that the love you hope to reclaim is simply no longer there. I walked toward the elevator, the small, antique key to their apartment heavy in my hand, praying that this night would not shatter the final, fragile piece of my heart. I was walking toward my son, carrying nothing but hope and the ghost of the woman who had bound us together, and I was ready for whatever truth awaited me. The elevator ride up to Ryan's apartment was silent, swift, and utterly isolating. As the doors opened, I stepped from the cramped confines of my hope into an environment that felt surgically sterile. This wasn't a home, it was a showroom. The air was cool, scented with something abstract and expensive, and the decor was all glass, chrome, and polished marble strikingly beautiful, yet lacking any trace of human clutter or lived experience. It was the antithesis of the warm, slightly chaotic energy of the home Margaret and I had built. Ryan opened the door immediately. He looked immaculate taller, broader in the shoulders than I remembered, dressed in tailored clothes that signaled unambiguous success. His smile, though wide, didn't quite reach his eyes. "Dad, you came," he said, the relief in his voice palpable. He embraced me a quick, firm, transactional hug that felt more like a professional greeting than a filial reunion. Emma emerged next, radiating a polished, controlled glamour. "Joseph, it's wonderful to finally have you here. I hope you like the ambience." "It's impressive," I managed, adjusting the collar of my suit, suddenly aware of how old and worn my clothes felt in this hyper-modern setting. They led me into the dining room. The table was set with theatrical formality, crisp linen, silverware arranged with military precision, and stemware that looked too delicate to hold anything but contemplation. The atmosphere was heavy with anticipation, but not the eager anticipation of a reunion. It felt more like the tense silence before a performance. The meal began. Emma's promised rack of lamb was indeed magnificent, presented with the flourish of a Michelin-starred chef. The wine, a vintage I vaguely recognized as being prohibitively expensive, was poured meticulously. Yet, despite the richness of the food and the quality of the vintage, the dinner felt fundamentally empty. The conversation was stilted, weaving awkwardly between polite inquiries and carefully chosen anecdotes. They didn't ask about the house, which was Margaret's house, or about my daily routine of mourning. They focused exclusively on external metrics. The restaurant is still running well. Then, Joseph Ryan asked, cutting a piece of lamb with unnecessary force. It is, I replied. George is managing the kitchen. It's consistent. Consistent? Emma echoed, tilting her wineglass. It's a great piece of real estate. Though, Joseph, that location is prime. Have you considered updating the interior? Or maybe finding an investor? The word hung in the air. A small, invasive probe. I quickly redirected, trying to inject some genuine warmth. I reached into my pocket and presented the small silver locket to Emma. This belonged to Margaret, I said softly. She loved it. I wanted you to have a piece of her history, to bless your future. Emma's reaction was jarring. She took the locket, turning it over in her hand, her expression one of mild, clinical assessment. Oh, how? Clark kind. Thank you. Joseph. It's very antique. She placed it immediately next to her bread plate, where it lay, cold and ignored beneath the harsh spotlights. The gesture, intended as an emotional bridge, had been dismissed as a curiosity. The chill in the room deepened. I watched them both. Ryan was talking rapidly, enthusiastically about his new business venture, a high-tech import-export platform. He spoke in buzzwords and acronyms, a language that was utterly foreign to the man I had raised. He wasn't connecting. He was pitching. His eyes darted between Emma, who offered small, encouraging smiles, and me, gauging my reaction. The stark realization began to crystallize. This dinner wasn't about reunion. It was about assessment. They never once brought up the past argument. They didn't apologize for the years of silence. They only offered carefully curated glimpses of their success, building a psychological barrier of achievement between their life and my humble existence. Ryan looked at me, his face etched with pride. But there was a strange, unsettling detachment in his gaze, as if he were admiring a relic he was about to sell. The food, the wine, the gleaming crystal, it all felt like a distraction. A heavy curtain draped over a much darker, less appetizing stage. My carefully nurtured hope, that small, fragile bird, was starting to flap frantically against the glass walls of this gilded cage. As the plates were cleared, the final, crucial shift in conversation occurred. Ryan leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential pitch. "Dad," he said, meeting my eyes for the first time with a look of intense, studied sincerity. "We need to talk about the future. Your future. You're getting older. Margaret is gone. We worry about you handling the complexities of the restaurant and the real estate, especially with all the new regulations." Emma chimed in, her voice smooth as silk. "We've been discussing taking over the management. Joseph, you could retire, live comfortably, maybe even transfer the ownership now, just to simplify the legal side of things." The mask was off. The truth was out. This wasn't a family dinner. It was a business meeting, cold and calculated, disguised as reconciliation. The air was thick with their unspoken hidden scheme. I looked at the untouched locket, the expensive lamb, and the detached eyes of my son. The loneliness of my empty house was nothing compared to the desolation of this table. I had walked into a beautifully set trap. The air in the dining room solidified around us, thick and suffocating. Ryan's words, transfer the ownership, simplify, the legal side of things were not an olive branch. They were the executioner's request. My son was not trying to reconcile. He was trying to liquidate me. I looked from Ryan's intense, professional stare to Emma's placid, expectant face. The luxurious rack of lamb on the plate suddenly tasted like ash. The expensive wine in my glass looked sinister. No longer a symbol of celebration, but an instrument of commerce. I felt a cold dread, deeper than any grief, because this betrayal was active, alive, and sitting directly across from me. I forced a tight, brittle smile. That's certainly a proposition. Ryan, a lot to think about. I needed time. My mind, usually sharp and decisive in the restaurant's heat, was reeling. I couldn't process that the man I raised was capable of such calculated cruelty, camouflaged by fine dining and tailored suits. Ryan, sensing my reluctance, pushed harder, his voice taking on an impatient edge. I remembered from our final argument. There's really not. Dad, we have the documents ready. Just a few signatures. And you can focus on yourself. It would take a lot of pressure off you. Think about your legacy. Yes, Joseph, Emma added, her tone dangerously smooth. We want to take care of everything. As she spoke, Ryan rose quickly. Let me top up your wine. Dad, it's a magnificent vintage. The best way to celebrate our new direction. It was exactly at that moment, as Ryan's back was turned, reaching for the bottle of deep red liquid on the side table, that my phone vibrated in my inner jacket pocket. The sound was muted, swallowed by the rich tapestry of the room. But the sensation was jarring. Instinctively, I reached inside, my movement hidden by the large centerpiece. It was a text message from an unknown number. There was no greeting, no context. Only 5 starkly urgent words. Leave now. Don't trust them. The message was a lightning bolt in the claustrophobic tension of the room. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering against my ribs. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a warning, a genuine, panicked warning sent by someone who knew. I glanced at the wine glass. Ryan was returning, a heavy, dark bottle in his hand, a look of benign, practiced cheer on his face. He extended the bottle towards my glass, ready to pour. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying speed. The unexpected invitation, the sterile formality of the dinner, Emma's sudden interest in the restaurant's valuation, the documents Ryan mentioned, and now the insistent refill of the wine. It wasn't just about the papers. They needed me compliant, distracted, or perhaps incapacitated. The terror was absolute, paralyzing. But the immediate threat of the wine pouring into my glass galvanized me. I couldn't hesitate. No. Ryan, stop, I said, my voice coming out louder and rougher than I intended. Ryan froze. The bottle tilted over my glass. Dad, what is it? I can't. I gasped, placing my hand over the rim of the glass. I suddenly feel quite unwell. A terrible, splitting headache. I think I need to leave immediately. Ryan's face flickered. The carefully constructed mask of concern momentarily slipped, revealing a flash of raw, frustrated panic. Emma's eyes narrowed instantly, a look of cold calculation replacing her warmth. Nonsense. Joseph, sit down, Emma commanded, the silk gone from her voice. Just have a little more wine. You'll feel better. It's just the stress of the city. No, I insisted, pushing back my chair. It scraped loudly against the marble floor, a defiant sound. The momentum was with me now. I apologize. I must go. I can't stay. We'll talk about the business later. Next week, I felt the locket, Margaret's locket, which still lay ignored by the bread plate calling out to me. I resisted the urge to grab it, knowing any pause would give them an opportunity to stop me. My primary objective was immediate escape. I moved with the kind of frantic, awkward speed only desperation can provide. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't look back. I simply walked, leaving the extravagant, poisoned comfort of their apartment behind. Ryan and Emma followed me only as far as the entryway, their attempts to dissuade me becoming increasingly strained, their voices laced with sharp, barely concealed urgency. "Dad, don't be ridiculous. We need to discuss the paperwork," Ryan shouted after me as I reached the elevator. I stabbed the button for the lobby repeatedly, ignoring their pleas. When the elevator doors finally slid open, I stepped inside, turning just before the doors closed. I looked at my son, my flesh and blood, the man I had hoped to hug and apologize to, and saw only a stranger consumed by greed. The doors shut, cutting off Ryan's final, angry protest. I leaned against the cold metal wall, shaking uncontrollably. The urgent text message still burned behind my eyelids. I was out. But the terrible truth of the night was only just beginning to sink in. I had come seeking reconciliation. I had found something far darker. I didn't know who had sent the warning. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that they had just saved my life. I was alive, but my son was lost. Perhaps forever. I don't remember the drive from Ryan's apartment back to my world. My mind was a chaotic blur of adrenaline, fear, and a cold, shocking comprehension of the abyss I had just stared into. The relief of escaping was immediate, but it was quickly overshadowed by a devastating, existential dread. I had gone seeking reconciliation. I had found attempted murder. I pulled the car over. Not toward home. The thought of returning to that empty house felt impossible, but to a brightly lit, impersonal gas station, parking lot. I leaned my head against the steering wheel, my hands still gripping the cold leather, still shaking. I looked down at the phone in my lap, the screen dark. But the 5 words of the anonymous message were seared into my memory. "Leave now. Don't trust them." Who sent it? A panicked friend of Emma's, a rival business associate. The question was secondary to the terrifying confirmation it provided. The wine was meant to incapacitate me. Or worse, permanently simplify the ownership transfer. My first, heartbroken instinct was denial. I wanted to drive home, crawl into bed, and pretend the whole evening had been a nightmare born of grief. But the voice of Margaret, the voice of my conscience, was uncompromisingly clear. This is not just about you, Joseph. This is about what we built. This is about protecting our integrity. I couldn't protect her memory by allowing criminals to run rampant. Least of all if those criminals were family. I had to face the unthinkable. I had to turn my son in. I drove toward the nearest police precinct. The transition from my quiet, personal terror to the stark, fluorescent reality of the police station was jarring. I walked in, a man in an expensive but rumpled suit, carrying the weight of a monumental betrayal. I was directed to a stern-faced detective named Miller, a man whose tired eyes seemed to have seen every variety of human failure. I sat across from him and began to speak, the words tumbling out disjointedly. At first, the years of estrangement, the sudden, suspicious invitation, the overly elaborate meal, the aggressive push for the ownership transfer, and finally, the anonymous text message. They wanted my restaurant. Detective, I managed, my throat tight with emotion. And I believe they planned to use that wine to stop me from saying no. Detective Miller listened with an impassive, professional calm that was strangely grounding. When I finished, he had only one request. I need the evidence. Mr. O'Connell, the documents, the text, anything to support the claim of premeditation. I handed him my phone, showing him the chilling text. Then, I pulled out the small, worn key to Ryan's apartment, the one Ryan had given me years ago for emergencies. The key I had kept in my wallet, a sentimental piece of metal that was now suddenly critical, and they mentioned documents, contracts for the transfer. I added, my voice hardening with final resolve. They must still be there. In the apartment, the hardest part was articulating the motive. I had to explain my own failings as a father, the bitter argument, Ryan's obsession with wealth, and the cold, mercenary nature of Emma. As I laid out the years of broken communication and my own blindness, I felt not just the despair of a victim, but the profound shame of a father who had raised a predator. I tried to reconnect with him. Detective, I admitted, my voice dropping to a whisper. I went there with hope. I left knowing that the son I raised is gone. He's been replaced by a stranger, a greedy stranger. Miller nodded slowly. Mr. O'Connell, it takes immense courage to walk in here and report a crime of this nature, especially when it involves your own family. But you did the right thing. If they were willing to go this far for property, there might be a larger pattern we need to uncover. I signed the statement and formally submitted the key and my phone as evidence. As I rose to leave, I felt physically lighter, though my soul was bruised beyond repair. I had traded the agonizing personal silence of my grief for the deafening, public noise of a criminal investigation. But for the first time since Margaret left, I felt I was doing something right, something she would have been proud of. The investigation was now out of my hands. My job as the father was over. My duty as a guardian of the truth had begun. I left the precinct and stepped out into the pre-dawn darkness. No longer a ghost, wandering his own life, but a reluctant witness, standing alone at the threshold of a devastating truth. The week that followed my visit to the precinct was a torment of suspended animation. I was living in a perpetual state of waiting for the detective's call, waiting for the silence to be broken, waiting for the final, brutal confirmation that my son was truly lost. I tried to resume my routines, the coffee, the shuffle, the management of the restaurant, but everything felt distant, filtered through a thick pane of glass. I was physically present, yet entirely consumed by the invisible machinery of the investigation I had set in motion. I stopped looking at the empty chair. Margaret's presence, usually a gentle comfort, now felt like a silent judge, observing the collapse of the world we had painstakingly built together. Detective Miller called exactly 3 days later. His voice, stripped of all professional neutrality, was grave. Mr. O'Connell, we moved quickly. Your description, the text message, and the key were enough to get a search warrant. I gripped the phone, my knuckles white. And Ryan. Ryan and Emma were detained late yesterday evening. But Mr. O'Connell, this is much bigger than an attempted inheritance scheme. What followed was a slow, agonizing drip feed of information that systematically dismantled every remaining shard of my hope and my denial. Miller explained that the luxurious apartment, the high-tech import-export business Ryan had boasted about, and the expensive vintage wine were all intricate parts of a meticulously constructed fayad. They weren't merely struggling entrepreneurs trying to cheat their aging father. They were deeply embedded in organized crime and large-scale money laundering. The restaurant, the foundation of Margaret's, and my life was not just valuable real estate. It was the ultimate prize. Your restaurant, Mr. O'Connell, is cash-heavy, perfectly located, and has a decades-long reputation for integrity, Miller said. It was the perfect target. They needed full, clean ownership to integrate it into their system, using its legitimate revenue to wash funds. The signature papers weren't just about inheritance. They were a corporate necessity for their criminal enterprise. The audacity was staggering. They hadn't just sought to steal my legacy. They sought to corrupt it, to turn Margaret's honest, hard-working dream into a machine for facilitating crime. The image of the rack of lamb and the magnificent vintage suddenly took on a sickening, almost surreal quality, a celebration of their impending corruption. The discovery validated the urgency of the anonymous text message, explaining why someone, likely an insider or a rival, aware of the night's planned move, had intervened. They didn't save me out of altruism, but their warning had saved my life and the integrity of the O'Connell name. The news hit me with a raw, physical force. It was one thing to believe your son capable of greed. It was another to accept him as a cold, calculating criminal, willing to risk his own father's life for a money laundering operation. My pride, my earlier judgment of Ryan's ambition, now seemed tragically misguided. I had judged him for chasing money. I never imagined he would chase criminality. I remembered Emma's placid, calculating eyes, and Ryan's impatient eagerness to pour that wine. They hadn't been looking at their father. They had been looking at an obstacle to be efficiently removed. The betrayal wasn't personal, it was transactional. That fact, somehow, was even more devastating. I spent the next few days working closely with the police, providing documentation on the restaurant's finances, its property history, and its operational records. Every signature I signed, every file I handed over, felt like another nail in Ryan's coffin. The irony was crushing. For years, I had lamented the empty chairs, Margaret's through fate, Ryan's through pride. Now, Ryan's chair was empty for a reason, far more terrifying, a cage built by his own avarice. I had yearned for reunion. But the reunion I got was this brutal clarity. The son I knew was gone long before Margaret. I found myself back in the kitchen, not for coffee, but seeking the grounded reality of my profession. I ran my hands over the stainless steel counters, the solid, dependable tools of honest work. This place, Margaret's legacy, was clean. I had protected it. I had protected her memory. The pain of knowing my son would face prison was immense, a hollow, aching despair. But that despair was tempered by a grim sense of necessary justice. The old man who had been a ghost in his own house was gone. In his place was a man who, though broken, had finally found the courage to draw a clear line between love and darkness. He had chosen truth over denial, and justice over a corrupted version of family. The official news was delivered to me like a death sentence, not for me, but for the future I had clung to. The warrants were executed. Ryan and Emma were formally charged, not just with conspiracy to defraud, but with serious counts of money laundering and organized crime. My restaurant's meticulous financial records, which I had so diligently protected for decades, were the very instrument that sealed their fate. The justice I had sought was now a cold, crushing reality. The pain of that realization was worse than any physical illness. When Margaret died, my grief was pure and simple, the sorrow of loss. This was something far more complex, a toxic cocktail of sorrow, shame, and a terrible, self-recriminating guilt. I was the father who had sent his own son to prison. The days that followed were a blur of media headlines and legal consultations. The press, drawn by the sensational nature of the case. The beloved local restaurateur betrayed by his greedy, successful son hounded the front door. I retreated into the one place they couldn't reach, the silent heart of my home, the kitchen. I would stand by the window, the faint morning light creeping over the horizon, and look at the life I had chosen to preserve. The restaurant survived, its reputation intact, its books clean. I had protected Margaret's legacy. That was the only victory I could claim. But victory felt hollow. I had saved my business, but I had permanently lost my child. I allowed myself one night of true, unadulterated despair. I walked into the bedroom, opened Margaret's closet, and inhaled the faint, persistent scent of her perfume. I let myself sink into the reality. The betrayal was complete. Yet, even in that darkest moment, the truth provided a strange, hard-won clarity. I realized that the boy I mourned, the son who loved milkshakes and showed me his first report card, was already gone. The man who sat across from me, the man who tried to poison his own father for a business ledger, was a stranger. My choice was not between saving Ryan and losing money. My choice was between denial and truth. I had chosen truth, and in choosing the truth, I chose to honor the life Margaret and I had built, a life founded on honesty, integrity, and hard work. The subsequent steps were deliberate, painful acts of self-reclamation. I cooperated fully with the prosecution. I gave my testimony, standing firm on the truth, enduring the cold, wounded stares Ryan directed at me from the defendant's box. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, worse than watching Margaret take her final breath. Because this death, the death of our family unit, was a brutal, public execution of a promise. But every painful word I spoke chipped away at the layers of shame and guilt I had carried for years. I was finally dismantling the walls of pride and grief that had imprisoned me. The case concluded swiftly, the evidence overwhelming. Ryan and Emma were convicted. The judge delivered the sentence. But the judgment I felt was internal, the painful realization that I was now truly alone. I returned home, not to the familiar, suffocating quiet, but to a silence that felt different, a final, necessary quiet. I sat in the breakfast nook. I looked at the empty chair, and for the first time in nearly 2 years, I didn't feel the paralyzing weight of emptiness. I felt resolution. My life, which I had believed to be over, had actually just begun its painful process of healing. Grief, I learned, doesn't disappear. It reshapes itself. Margaret's memory no longer served as a constant reminder of loss, but as a compass guiding me toward resilience. I began to tend the garden, the place where she used to grow her tulips. I started talking to my old staff again, sharing a cup of coffee at the counter, allowing their warmth and noise back into my isolated world. The restaurant, now entirely mine again, felt like a safe harbor. The journey taught me a devastating but crucial lesson that sometimes the bravest act is not holding on to someone out of love, but letting go to uphold the truth. I had stood up for myself, for Margaret, and for the integrity of our memory against the ultimate betrayal. And so, each morning still begins the same way, with quiet and with coffee. But now, when I look at the empty chair, I am no longer waiting for a voice that will never answer. I am sitting in the stillness, acknowledging the pain, but also embracing the future. I am a survivor, not a ghost. I am Joseph, the man who chose courage over comfort, and the man who, finally, is ready to live again. The silence I returned to was the hardest earned quiet of my life. It was no longer the suffocating weight of Margaret's absence, nor the frantic, desperate charge of a life under threat. This was the stillness of a battlefield, after the war is won exhausted, scarred, but finally safe. Ryan was gone, his fate sealed by his own avarice, and the legal system I had reluctantly engaged. His absence was now permanent, final, and tragically deserved. I was a father without a son, but I was also a man who had reclaimed his integrity. The immediate aftermath was a long, slow exercise in dismantling my past defense mechanisms. The restaurant became my anchor again, not as a desperate escape, but as the embodiment of Margaret's enduring legacy. I worked alongside George, no longer the detached owner, but the guiding hand, ensuring every dish, every customer interaction, honored the honest foundation we had built. I found myself tending the garden again, the very spot where Margaret used to grow her tulips. I dug my hands into the rich, damp soil, physical labor that grounded me to the present. As I worked, I realized that grief and healing were not opposite forces, they were collaborators. Healing was not about forgetting the wound, it was about accepting the scar and allowing new life to grow around it. The house, once a museum of absence, slowly began to change. I didn't erase Margaret, never that. Her books remained on the shelf, her perfume on the dresser. But I allowed the sun in. I changed the dead air. I even moved the furniture slightly, creating small, almost imperceptible shifts in the layout. These were not acts of erasure, they were acts of re-entry. I was claiming the house back as a living space, not a tomb. And the chair, I finally moved the empty chair away from the breakfast nook. I didn't discard it, I placed it in the living room, near the fireplace, allowing it to become a beautiful antique piece of furniture. A memory, not a monument. It was a painful, necessary act of letting Margaret be a cherished part of my history, instead of the central, agonizing feature of my present. The crucial turning point was accepting the role I played in the breakdown with Ryan. My rigidity, my pride, my inability to bridge the gap, they didn't cause his criminality, but they certainly created the distance that allowed it to flourish, unseen and unchallenged. Healing, I learned, required self-forgiveness. The deepest, most profound lesson I took from this devastating chapter concerned the nature of survival and the meaning of love. I had believed that love was about holding on, about loyalty to family regardless of the cost. I was wrong. Grief taught me that love doesn't die when the person does. It simply changes form. It transmutes into courage, resilience, and memory. The curse of survival is carrying the pieces of the past, but the gift is the freedom to reshape those pieces into something new. I realized that the ultimate act of love, both for Margaret's memory and for myself, was the courage to choose truth over comforting illusion. Choosing to expose Ryan, though agonizing, was an act of profound self-respect, and the only way to protect the integrity of the life Margaret and I had forged. My healing began the moment I stopped hoping for a version of my son who no longer existed and accepted the responsibility of living my own life bravely. I had been waiting for the world to notice my absence. Instead, I had to deliberately re-engage with it, scar tissue and all. I had found the profound truth that solitude is not loneliness when it is filled with self-respect. I now sit by the window every morning, still with my coffee, watching the streetlights fade. The world outside still wakes up joggers, delivery trucks, kids on their way to school, all moving forward. But now, I am moving too. I am not the ghost I used to be. I am Joseph, the proprietor, the widower, the survivor. I am a man who was deeply wounded, but who chose to face the darkest truth and won. The silence remains, but now it's a companion, a spacious, quiet confirmation that I am whole enough to sit and listen to the faint, beautiful echoes of the life that was, and the confident, steady rhythm of the life that is to come. I may have lost my son, but I found myself, and for the first time in a very long time, I feel complete. The sun rises, painting the sky with a fierce, challenging light, and I am ready for the day. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.